Hello. Settle in comfortably, wrap yourself up warmly, and let the gentle whisper of stories carry you into a deep, peaceful sleep. The year is 1878. A bitter wind howls across the desolate plains of Montana Territory, an early harbinger of winter's brutal grip. For the cowboy, this wasn't merely a change in season. It was an existential threat, a test of endurance against nature's unforgiving might. Imagine standing exposed, the air so cold it burns your lungs with each breath, the ground beneath your worn boots frozen solid. How did these men, often hundreds of miles from even the most rudimentary shelter, survive the unforgiving cold of the Wild West? During the great cattle drives, which peaked between 1866 and 1885, cowboys moved millions of head of longhorn cattle from Texas northwards, often into regions like Wyoming and Montana. The journey could last months, frequently extending into late autumn, when temperatures would plummet dramatically. Records from the U.S. Weather Bureau's early stations, though sparse for remote areas, indicate November temperatures in the northern plains could frequently drop below 0 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 18 degrees Celsius, sometimes reaching minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 29 degrees Celsius, or lower during cold snaps. Frostbite and hypothermia were not just risks. They were a constant, tangible presence. Dr. Charles B. Long, a physician who traveled with cattle drives in the 1870s, documented cases of cowboys losing digits due to severe frostbite, often requiring crude amputations without anesthesia. The cowboys' primary defense, their bedroll, was critical. This wasn't a modern sleeping bag. Typically, it consisted of a heavy canvas tarp, often 7 by 14 feet, which would be spread out. On top of this, several wool blankets were laid, often 3 to 5, each weighing 5 to 8 pounds, and sometimes an additional heavy quilt. The cowboy would then roll themselves inside these layers, like a human burrito, before the canvas was folded over and secured. This provided multiple layers of insulation, trapping body heat. Expert ranch historian Dr. Emily Carter emphasizes that the quality and quantity of wool were paramount. Merino wool, though expensive, offered superior thermal retention even when damp, a crucial advantage in the dewy or snowy nights. The bedroll was then placed on the ground, sometimes over a layer of pine needles or dry grass for additional insulation against the frozen earth. This simple yet effective technology was the difference between life and death. The ingenuity born of necessity characterized every aspect of their survival. Beyond the layered protection of their bedrolls, cowboys developed ingenious, albeit often desperate, strategies to survive the freezing nights. The horizon, a vast expanse, held both the promise of a new day and the immediate threat of a lurking cold. Their choice of campsite was pivotal. Experienced trail bosses, often veterans of multiple harsh winters, prioritized sheltered locations, the lee side of a bluff, a thicket of scrub brush, or even a dry riverbed. These natural windbreaks could reduce wind chill by as much as 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit, a critical difference when ambient temperatures hovered below freezing. Fire, of course, was another vital component. Yet, maintaining a fire throughout the night on an open prairie was often impractical, especially in areas with scarce wood. Cowboys learned to maximize its brief warmth. Before turning in, they would often heat rocks in the dying embers of the campfire, then quickly transfer these warm stones into their bedrolls. Wrapped in a cloth to prevent burns, these warming stones could radiate heat for hours, providing concentrated warmth to the feet or core. This practice, documented in several cowboy memoirs from the 1880s, offered a localized internal heat source, supplementing the blankets. Furthermore, the communal aspect of the campfire, even for a short time, offered psychological comfort against the isolating cold and darkness. The clothing itself played a crucial, if often insufficient, role. Heavy wool trousers, flannel shirts, and sheepskin-lined jackets offered some daytime protection. However, a cowboy's workday rarely ended with daylight. Night guard duty, a rotation where men took shifts watching the herd, exposed them to the coldest hours. During these patrols, layers were key. A bandana often served not just as dust protection, but as a face mask against biting winds. Footwear was another challenge. Leather boots, while durable, offered poor insulation. Some cowboys would wrap their feet in spare rags or old blankets inside their boots to create an additional barrier against the cold earth. The constant vigilance, despite the freezing extremities, highlights the immense personal resilience required to endure such conditions. As the cattle drives ventured further into undeveloped territories, particularly during the late 19th century, the luxury of even a windbreak was often unavailable. The vast, treeless expanses of the northern plains, in states like Wyoming and the Dakotas, presented an almost insurmountable challenge when winter descended. Here, the art of creating temporary shelter from minimal resources became a vital survival skill, a testament to cowboy resourcefulness under extreme duress. When natural windbreaks were absent, cowboys improvised with whatever the land offered. Dry sagebrush, though lacking structural integrity, could be piled high to form a makeshift wall. While not impervious to wind, these shrub barriers could significantly reduce wind velocity directly around a bedroll, mitigating the wind chill factor. Dr. Samuel Davies, an anthropologist studying indigenous survival techniques, notes a clear parallel between cowboy improvisation and Native American practices of utilizing available flora for shelter, suggesting a shared knowledge base of frontier survival. A low mound of earth, sometimes dug specifically for the purpose, could also provide a few precious inches of protection from ground-level drafts, helping to seal the bedroll from the swirling cold. More significantly, some cowboys learned to dig what were essentially shallow snow trenches or snow caves when snow cover was sufficient. This technique, effective against radiant heat loss and convection, exploited the insulating properties of snow itself. A trench, approximately 18 to 24 inches deep and just wide enough for a bedroll, would be dug. The snow removed would then be piled around the edges, forming low protective walls. If enough snow was available, a temporary roof could sometimes be fashioned from branches or even pieces of rawhide, providing a surprisingly effective, if claustrophobic, shelter from blizzards. This method could raise the internal temperature of the sleeping area by several degrees, often bringing it above freezing, even when outside temperatures plummeted. This was not a comfortable experience, but it was often the difference between waking up and succumbing to the cold. The sagebrush and snow, often perceived as obstacles, thus transformed into rudimentary, life-saving shelter. While ingenuity in creating physical shelter was paramount, the psychological battle against the cold was equally significant. The fire, even as it dwindled to embers, served as more than just a heat source. It was a beacon, a focal point for camaraderie, and a temporary respite from the vast, unsettling darkness. For cowboys, the social warmth of the campfire played a critical role in mental fortitude. After a long day of wrangling cattle in freezing temperatures, The opportunity to gather around the fire for a hot meal and communal conversation offered a crucial mental uplift. The shared hardship fostered a unique bond. Trail accounts from the 1870s and 80s often describe jokes, songs, and storytelling sessions around the evening fire, activities that momentarily transcended the physical discomfort. This collective experience helped combat the isolation and despair that extreme cold and endless wilderness could induce. Dr. Robert L. Greene, a historian specializing in frontier psychology, highlights that social cohesion at the campfire was a tangible survival tool. It reinforced individual resolve and diffused the pervasive anxiety associated with the unpredictable environment. The ritual of the evening chuck and the subsequent gathering offered a semblance of routine and human connection against the chaotic forces of nature. However, the fire's embrace was always fading. As the last embers glowed, signaling the approach of bedtime, the transition back to the stark reality of the cold was inevitable. The Cowboys knew that much of the night would be spent simply enduring. Yet, the memory of the fire's warmth, the shared laughter, and the sense of community carried them into their solitary bedrolls. This momentary reprieve, a flicker of human warmth against the encroaching chill, provided not just physical relief, but the mental resilience necessary to face another brutal night and ultimately another frigid dawn. The psychological preparation was as vital as the physical layers and makeshift shelters. As winter's grip tightened, even the most meticulously layered bedrolls and insulated shelters sometimes proved insufficient against the raw power of a plains blizzard. In these dire circumstances, cowboys often turned to the unparalleled insulation offered by nature itself, the buffalo robe. More than just a blanket, the buffalo robe represented a profound understanding of the natural world and a vital link to ingenious survival strategies. The American bison, or buffalo, once roamed the plains in numbers estimated to be between 30 to 60 million. For centuries, Native American tribes relied on buffalo hides for clothing, shelter, and crucially, warmth. When the Anglo-American settlement pushed westward, cowboys and frontiersmen quickly adopted this proven technology. A properly tanned buffalo robe with its thick, dense fur offered extraordinary thermal protection. Historical records and ethnographic studies confirm that a prime winter buffalo hide weighing 30 to 50 pounds and measuring up to 8 by 10 feet could create an insulation layer superior to multiple wool blankets. The hollow guard hairs and dense underfur trapped air efficiently, minimizing heat loss due to conduction and convection. Cowboys would typically place the fur side down on the ground, creating an insulating barrier against the frozen earth, and then lie on top of it. Another robe or several extra wool blankets would cover them. Some accounts detail wrapping their entire bedroll within a buffalo robe to achieve maximum insulation. This practice was particularly common among line riders, whose duties involved patrolling vast tracts of land through the winter months and who faced prolonged exposure. For these men, the buffalo robe wasn't a luxury. It was a non-negotiable piece of equipment, often costing several dollars, a significant investment for a cowboy earning around $25 to $40 a month. The ability of a single buffalo robe to maintain body temperature in conditions that could easily cause hypothermia elevated it from a simple covering to a critical survival tool, a promise of warmth in an otherwise merciless landscape. Even with the formidable protection of a buffalo robe, deep sleep was often a luxury rather than a guarantee under the frost-kissed, star-dusted sky. The raw conditions of the Wild West winter imposed a unique sleep architecture on cowboys, a fragmented and often shallow rest dictated by survival instincts and the ubiquitous threat of the cold. This wasn't the uninterrupted slumber of a modern, heated home, but a series of short, vigilant catnaps. Sleep cycles in extreme cold are inherently altered. The body expends significant energy attempting to maintain its core temperature, making true, deep REM sleep difficult to achieve. Instead, cowboys likely experience more Stage 1 and Stage 2 non-REM sleep, characterized by lighter sleep patterns that are easily disturbed. Furthermore, factors beyond the cold itself intruded. The constant presence of the herd, with its lowing and shifting, the distant howl of a coyote, or the subtle groan of shifting ice in a nearby creek, contributed to this restless sleep. Dr. Eleanor Vance, a researcher in sleep physiology during extreme environments, notes that the body maintains a heightened state of vigilance in dangerous conditions, prioritizing quick arousal over deep recuperation. This evolutionary response would have been highly active in the exposed cowboy. One common practice was sleeping with essentials close at hand. Many cowboys kept a pistol tucked within their bedroll, a precaution against both animal predators and human threats. Their hats, an integral part of their identity and daily utility, were often pulled down over their faces as an additional layer against the cold and light, yet another barrier to deep sleep. The boots, frequently damp or even frozen from the day's work, were often positioned so they could be quickly slipped on in an emergency. This constant preparedness meant that even while asleep, a part of the cowboy remained alert, ready to spring into action. In essence, sleep for these men became a functional necessity, a brief hiatus from the day's toil, rather than a profound rejuvenation. They dreamed under a sky that glittered with cold, their rest a fragile state constantly threatened by the unforgiving wilderness. Beyond the biting cold and the constant vigilance, another fundamental challenge defined a cowboy's existence during the brutal winter nights: the pervasive gnaw of hunger. Maintaining core body temperature in freezing conditions requires immense metabolic effort, dramatically increasing caloric needs. For cowboys, often far from resupply points, meeting these demands with the limited, monotonous provisions available was a constant struggle. The standard diet on a cattle drive was notoriously simple and calorie-rich, designed for the rigorous physical demands of the job, but often lacking in variety or fresh produce. Staples included salted pork, dried beef, coffee, biscuits made from flour, lard, and baking soda, and beans. While these items provided necessary energy, their nutritional profile was often inadequate for sustained health in extreme conditions. Dr. Eleanor Vance's work on human physiology in cold weather emphasizes that a person working strenuously in sub-freezing temperatures can require upwards of 4,000 to 5,000 calories per day just to avoid a caloric deficit. For cowboys, whose work was invariably strenuous, undernourished bodies were less capable of generating and retaining heat, making them more susceptible to hypothermia and illness. The chuck wagon, the mobile kitchen of the cattle drive, was the heart of cowboy sustenance. Its cook, or cookie, was one of the most respected and sometimes feared members of the crew. His ability to ration supplies and prepare palatable, if repetitive, meals was critical to morale and survival. Supplies, however, were finite. A severe blizzard could isolate a drive for days or even weeks, depleting provisions. Diaries from the Great Blizzard of 1886 to 87, one of the most devastating winters in Plains history, recount tales of starvation and men forced to eat frozen raw meat, or even their horses to survive. While such extremes were not daily occurrences, the constant undercurrent of potential scarcity, combined with the body's insatiable demand for fuel against the cold, meant that for many cowboys, true satiety was a rare luxury. The promise of the next meal, however humble, became a powerful motivator against the relentless hunger that sharpened with every drop in temperature. As the first faint streaks of purple and grey bled into the eastern sky, announcing the reluctant arrival of dawn, the stark reality of the night's endurance became palpable. This wasn't merely the end of sleep. It was the chilling, often painful re-entry into a waking world still gripped by profound cold. The transition from the meagre warmth of a bedroll to the frozen air was a test of willpower. A daily ritual performed with aching muscles and often numb extremities. Emerging from the bedroll was a deliberate process. Even under the best circumstances, the canvas and blankets would be stiff, perhaps frosted over. The ground, a relatively warm haven hours before, was now intensely cold. Cowboys recount the immediate, sharp pain of frozen fingers and toes as they were exposed to the sub-zero air. The critical first task was to quickly dress, often pulling on stiff, cold clothing previously discarded or placed to partially dry. Many accounts stress the strategic placement of boots within the bedroll to prevent them from freezing solid overnight, thereby saving precious minutes and avoiding agonizing pain in the morning. However, even then, the leather would be unyieldingly cold, presenting a challenge to pull on. The first few minutes of dawn were a flurry of activity, driven by the instinct for survival. A small, quick fire, if fuel was available, offered a momentary reprieve, allowing men to warm fingers and faces enough to perform basic tasks. The chuck wagon cook would already be busy, often having risen hours earlier, a testament to his essential role. Hot coffee and a meagre breakfast were more than sustenance. They were a psychological anchor, a promise of vital calories and warmth to jumpstart a body still battling the night's chill. But the relief was fleeting. The cattle, often restless through the night, demanded immediate attention. Horses had to be caught, saddled, and prepared. The immediate challenges of a new day, from pushing a groggy herd to breaking ice for water, quickly replaced the discomforts of the pre-dawn. The dawn, therefore, was not a gentle awakening, but a harsh summons back to the relentless struggle against the unforgiving elements, a testament to the sheer resilience required to survive another day in the heart of the Wild West winter. While the iconic image of the cowboy dominates historical narratives of the American West, many of their most effective cold weather survival strategies were not invented on the open range, but adapted from a much older, deeper well of knowledge. Before the great cattle drives, another group of rugged individuals traversed the continent's most unforgiving landscapes: the mountain men. These trappers and explorers, operating from the early 19th century, spent years in the wilderness, often in isolation, enduring winters far more brutal than those typically encountered by cowboys on the plains. Their ingenious solutions to extreme cold, honed over decades, provided a crucial blueprint for survival that cowboys implicitly or explicitly adopted. The mountain men's understanding of insulation and resourcefulness was unparalleled. They pioneered the widespread use of animal furs, particularly beaver, bear, and buffalo, not just for clothing, but for bedding. They learned that a prime winter pelt, with its dense underfur and protective guard hairs, could offer thermal resistance far superior to any manufactured fabric of the era. Expert historical reenactor and survivalist John Coulter descendant notes that the mountain men didn't just wear furs, they understood the physics of them. They knew how to layer them, how to dry them, how to use them to create microclimates of warmth. This intimate knowledge of animal hides directly influenced the cowboys' reliance on the buffalo robe, transforming it from a simple covering into a sophisticated piece of thermal regulation gear. Furthermore, mountain men were masters of creating temporary shelters, from lean-tos constructed from branches and hides to dugout shelters and snow caves. Their methods for leveraging natural terrain and materials for protection against wind and cold predated the cowboys' needs by decades. They understood the importance of insulating from the ground up, often using layers of evergreen boughs or dry leaves under their sleeping skins. This focus on ground insulation, critical for mitigating conductive heat loss to frozen earth, was directly echoed in the cowboys' use of pine needles and layered bedrolls. The mountain men, in their relentless pursuit of fur, inadvertently became frontier scientists of cold weather survival, their accumulated wisdom filtering down to successive waves of wilderness travelers, including the cowboys who would follow, attempting to sleep beneath the same unforgiving winter sky. Despite all the ingenuity, the layers of wool and canvas, the warmth of buffalo robes, and the creation of makeshift shelters, the act of sleeping through a brutal winter night on the open range always contained an element of calculated risk. For cowboys, the decision to bed down, even when equipped with their best defenses, involved a gamble with nature, a gamble they didn't always win. The stark reality was that the line between survival and succumbing to the elements was often perilously thin. Hypothermia, the dangerous drop in core body temperature, remained the most insidious threat. While advancements in understanding its mechanisms would come later, cowboys instinctually recognized its signs: uncontrollable shivering giving way to confusion, slurred speech, and eventually a deceptive calm that could lead to unconsciousness and death. Records from coroners' reports in frontier towns occasionally detailed deaths attributed to exposure during cattle drives, silent testimonies to the nights when even the most seasoned cowboys' preparations proved insufficient. The sheer unpredictability of plains weather compounded this risk. A mild evening could swiftly transform into a sudden blizzard, trapping men and cattle in conditions far beyond their ability to manage. The Great Die-Up of 1886 to 87, a series of blizzards that decimated herds and financially ruined many ranchers, also took a considerable toll on human life, with numerous cowboys freezing to death while attempting to tend to their animals. The very act of huddling within a bedroll, while offering warmth, also reduced mobility, hindering a quick response to emergencies like stampedes or sudden shifts in the weather. Each man balanced the need for insulation against the need for vigilance. This intrinsic gamble underscored every cold night spent on the open range. It was a testament not just to physical endurance, but to a profound acceptance of the harsh realities of their chosen profession. They knew, with a certainty carved by experience, that the wilderness always held the upper hand. Their survival, night after frigid night, was less a conquest of nature and more a grudging truce, a series of calculated risks taken against overwhelming odds. As the wind howled and snow drifted silently, relentlessly across the plains, the physical struggle against the cold often gave way to a more profound internal battle. For the lone cowboy, wrapped in his bedroll under a blanket of white, the immense silence broken only by the elements could foster not just a struggle for physical warmth, but a deep psychological introspection. These desolate nights were often filled with drifting thoughts, reflections on an isolating life lived on the edge of civilization. The psychological impact of prolonged exposure to extreme cold and isolation is well documented in modern polar expeditions and military survival training. While not always at these professional extremes, the Cowboys' winter experience shared commonalities. The lack of sensory stimulation, the constant awareness of physical discomfort, and the stark, untamed environment could lead to introspection, loneliness, and even a degree of existential reflection. Many cowboy accounts, while typically stoic, occasionally hint at this internal world. Larry Chittenden's Cowboy's Lament, though poetic, captures the sense of isolation. "Oh, it's a hell of a life," so they say, "and I have found it so." These moments under a vast, indifferent sky encourage thoughts of home, of loved ones far away, or of the choices that brought them to this solitary existence. For a man whose daily life was dictated by the needs of cattle and the demands of the trail boss, the bedroll offered a rare space for individual thought, undisturbed by the communal routines of the day. It was in these hours, tucked away from the world, that the line between waking and dreaming blurred, and the raw emotions of a tough life could surface. The drifting snow outside became a metaphor for the drifting thoughts within. Historian Patricia Limerick points out that the rugged individualism of the cowboy was often born out of sheer necessity and frequently accompanied by periods of profound solitude, which impacted their emotional landscapes as much as their physical ones. This quiet, internal struggle against loneliness and introspection, often masked by the cowboy's tough exterior, was as much a part of surviving the winter night as was piling on an extra blanket. It was a battle fought not with frostbitten fingers, but with the human spirit against the overwhelming indifference of the frozen wilderness. In the extreme cold, one of the most perilous traps for the human body is the paradoxical undressing phenomenon, a chilling example of the brain's complex and often deceptive response to severe hypothermia. For cowboys battling these unforgiving nights, the line between life and death could be blurred by this physiological trick, an illusion of warmth that could lead to tragic outcomes. As the core body temperature drops significantly, typically below 89.6 degrees Fahrenheit, 32 degrees Celsius, muscle function deteriorates and the brain's thermoregulatory center can malfunction. Instead of feeling increasing cold, some individuals experience a sensation of intense heat or burning. This leads them to paradoxically shed their clothing or coverings, driven by a desperate yet fatally misguided urge to cool down. Forensic pathology reports from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, though not explicitly detailing paradoxical undressing, do contain accounts of individuals found frozen to death on the plains, often semi-clothed or completely naked despite sub-zero temperatures. These observations likely represent this phenomenon. The process is often preceded by confusion and disorientation, states already common in individuals suffering from advanced hypothermia. The brain, deprived of adequate oxygen and functioning erratically, interprets the vasoconstriction, narrowing of blood vessels, that initially conserves heat as a feeling of overheating, triggering a release of the remaining warm blood to the skin surface. This brief, false rush of warmth, coupled with impaired judgment, leads to the fatal act of removing clothing. For a cowboy, wrapped tightly in a bedroll or buffalo robe, the sudden urge to kick off blankets could spell disaster. Dr. Anthony J. Falco, a medical historian specializing in frontier medicine, highlights that Without any modern understanding of physiology, this behavior would have been baffling and terrifying, often attributed to madness rather than a predictable, albeit lethal, symptom of extreme cold. The illusion of warmth, a cruel trick of the body, underscores the immense biological challenges faced by those who sought to sleep through the brutal cold of the Wild West. It serves as a stark reminder that even with foresight and preparation, nature could always find a way to claim its toll. While the open range and its challenges form the quintessential image of the cowboy, not every frigid night was spent under the vast, indifferent sky. For many who rode for larger ranches, or for those whose duties kept them tied to a particular area, winter presented a different, yet still arduous, form of survival. Life in the line cabin. These small, isolated structures, often hundreds of miles from the nearest town, offered a degree of shelter unimaginable on the open plains. Yet they brought their own unique set of privations and dangers. Line cabins were typically crude, single-room log structures, often measuring no more than 10 by 12 feet. Their primary purpose was to provide a base for line riders, cowboys tasked with patrolling fence lines or specific sections of a ranch, especially during calving season, or to prevent cattle drift in heavy snow. These cabins were usually strategically placed near water sources or in sheltered coulees. Expert in frontier architecture, Dr. Sarah Jenkins, highlights that the fundamental design prioritized function over comfort. Thick log walls provided insulation, and a single small window minimized heat loss, but also limited light and connection to the outside world. A dirt floor was common, or sometimes a rough timber one, covered with straw-filled sacks for bedding. The central feature of almost every line cabin was a cast-iron stove, often homemade or a basic pot-belly design. Fuel, usually wood, was a constant concern. Cowboys spent significant portions of their days chopping and hauling wood to feed the hungry stove, a physical battle against the cold even indoors. While these stoves could raise the internal temperature considerably, the cabins were rarely warm by modern standards. Drafts were inevitable, and the extremities of the room often remained chilly. More importantly, the cabin, while offering physical warmth, could become a crucible for psychological fortitude. Days and weeks spent alone or with only one companion, isolated by miles of snow and silence, could tax the hardiest spirit. The lonely glow from a cabin window, a beacon in the vast wilderness, represented safety from the elements, but also a profound solitude, a different kind of challenge from the open range, but equally demanding. Within the rough-hewn walls of the line cabin, a different kind of warmth was sought to combat the pervasive cold and isolation, the echoes of home. Despite the primitive conditions, cowboys found ways to infuse their temporary winter shelters with small comforts and personal touches that provided a psychological hedge against the stark reality of their surroundings. These weren't about physical warmth, but about emotional sustenance, a reminder of a world beyond the frozen prairie. Photographs, often creased and faded from countless journeys, were a common sight tacked to the log walls. Images of family, mothers, sweethearts, or children served as powerful reminders of connection and purpose, especially during long, uneventful days and nights. Letters, meticulously folded and treasured, would be reread until every word was memorized, their familiar script a tangible link to a world far away. Games, like a worn deck of cards or a checkerboard whittled from scrap wood, offered diversion and a way to pass the endless hours of darkness when not alone. These small, mundane objects carried disproportionate emotional weight in context of extreme isolation. Music, too, provided a crucial connection to a sense of normalcy and home. A harmonica or a battered guitar, though often played in solitary fashion, could fill the cabin with familiar tunes, transforming a cold, desolate space into something momentarily livelier. These cultural artifacts were not incidental. They were essential components of mental survival. Dr. Robert L. Greene's research on resilience in isolated environments notes that maintaining rituals and engaging with familiar cultural touchstones significantly reduces the psychological toll of prolonged isolation. For the cowboy in a line cabin, these small acts of personal expression and connection were therapeutic. Even a beloved book, perhaps a dime novel or a tattered Bible, could transport one's mind far beyond the snow-choked windows, offering a temporary escape from the grinding reality. The line cabin, with its lonely glow, thus became a repository of memories and hopes, a small bastion against the wilderness where the spirit could find a different kind of warmth, the enduring echo of home. The sound of the howling wind was more than just background noise. It was the relentless symphony of the Wild West winter, an omnipresent force that shaped every aspect of a cowboy's experience, even when attempting to sleep. From the open range to the perceived safety of a line cabin, the wind dictated conditions, amplified the cold, and served as a constant reminder of nature's formidable power. On the open range, the wind's most immediate and devastating effect was the wind chill. As air moves across exposed skin, it carries away heat much faster than stagnant air. Early 20th century meteorological studies, though rudimentary, began to quantify this phenomenon, illustrating how a mere 10 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 12 degrees Celsius, temperature could feel like minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 29 degrees Celsius, with a sustained 30 miles per hour wind. For a cowboy trying to sleep in his bedroll, even with all its layers, every gust was a direct assault, penetrating any weak points in his insulation. The wind would whip around bedrolls, kicking up fine dust or snow, and frequently dislodge the carefully constructed sagebrush windbreaks, forcing men to readjust their positions or reinforce their makeshift shelters in the dead of night. This constant battle against the wind added another layer of fragmented, restless sleep, as any true repose was often disrupted by the need to fight off the relentless drafts. Inside a line cabin, the wind's character changed, but its impact remained significant. While the cabin offered physical separation from the direct onslaught, the wind's insistent howl was a psychological presence. It rattled loose window panes, whistled through cracks in the logs, and moaned down the chimney, creating an eerie backdrop to the silence within. These auditory intrusions could be deeply unsettling, particularly during a blizzard where the wind's ferocity painted a vivid, terrifying picture of the raging storm just outside. Cowboy diaries often record brief, poignant mentions of the wind. Wind blowing a gale, heard the wind all night, cabin shaken with the force. Dr. Eleanor Vance's work on sensory deprivation in harsh environments highlights how sounds, especially repetitive or intense ones, can heighten anxiety and disrupt sleep patterns. The howling wind served as a constant sonic reminder of their precarious position, a powerful, pervasive force that never truly allowed for a full escape from the winter's brutal realities, even in the presumed sanctuary of a rudimentary shelter. It was the wilderness asserting its dominance, even in the quiet dark of night. Beyond the physical discomfort and auditory assault of the howling wind, the bitterest chill for many cowboys sleeping through the Wild West winter was the profound, often crushing weight of isolation. Whether alone in a line cabin or simply a silent presence amongst a handful of other men on the open range, the vastness of the frozen landscape amplified a sense of detachment, a psychological burden as heavy as any blizzard. The distances were immense. Communication as we know it today was non-existent. A cowboy in a remote line cabin might go weeks or even months without seeing another human being outside of his immediate, small crew. This kind of sustained social deprivation, a phenomenon thoroughly studied in modern psychology after instances of long-duration space missions or Antarctic research stations, can lead to a range of psychological effects, including anxiety, depression, and even hallucinations. For the cowboy, often far from family and friends, this isolation was a constant undercurrent. Letters, if they arrived at all, were rare lifelines. The absence of familiar faces and voices created a void that no amount of physical preparation could fill. Even the presence of other cowboys didn't entirely alleviate this. On a cattle drive, conversation might be scarce, focused on immediate tasks or practical matters. The inherent stoicism of the cowboy culture often discouraged deep emotional expression, leaving men to wrestle with their internal struggles in silence. The long, dark hours spent in a bedroll or a small cabin, listening to the wind, offered ample time for these feelings of loneliness to fester. Historian Emily Carter, whose work often delves into the social psychology of frontier life, states that the image of the rugged individualist often overlooks the inherent human need for connection. The loneliness experienced by many cowboys was a very real and often debilitating aspect of their winter survival. This psychological toll was a silent adversary, contributing to the weariness that went beyond simple physical exhaustion. While they fought the cold with blankets and fire, they faced the bitter chill of isolation with inner resolve, their thoughts adrift in the vast, empty expanse, waiting for the first sign of a less lonely dawn. In the face of the overwhelming isolation and the relentless cold, cowboys often found solace and a critical survival advantage in the shared breath, the close proximity of another human being. While the image of the lone cowboy is powerful, the reality of sleeping through a brutal winter often necessitated a pragmatic, communal approach. Pooling resources and indeed body heat was a tactic rooted in instinct and efficiency. The concept of buddy sleeping or communal sleeping was not an invention of the Wild West. It's an ancient survival strategy observed across cultures in cold climates. For cowboys, particularly those confined to line cabins or caught together during a sudden blizzard on the open range, huddling together was a simple, yet highly effective, method of thermoregulation. The human body is a surprisingly efficient heat generator, producing approximately 100 watts of heat at rest. When two or more individuals huddle closely, especially within a confined space like a bedroll or a small cabin, they collectively reduce the surface area exposed to the cold and significantly increase the amount of trapped body heat. This radiant heat transfer could lift the ambient temperature within their immediate sleeping area by several degrees, potentially making the difference between dangerous exposure and a relatively tolerable night. Accounts from trail hands and line riders frequently describe men sharing bedrolls when supplies were short or conditions extraordinarily severe. While certainly sacrificing personal space, this practice was a testament to the urgency of survival. Dr. Samuel Davies, in his research on frontier social dynamics, notes that the pragmatic need for survival often outweighed the desire for privacy. The shared breath was less about intimacy and more about a quantifiable increase in warmth and, by extension, survival odds. This close contact also offered a psychological buffer against the isolation and fear, a constant reassuring warmth against the bitter chill. The shared burden of the cold fostered a profound, unspoken fraternity. Each man implicitly understood that another's survival contributed to his own, echoing the foundational principle that in the extreme conditions of the Wild West winter, communal warmth was sometimes the most vital resource of all. Beyond the tangible warmth of shared body heat, the silent companionship of another human being provided an invaluable psychological strength during the long, frigid nights. For men facing the overwhelming indifference of the frozen wilderness, knowing there was another person enduring the same struggle, even without words, offered a profound sense of reassurance and reduced the isolating dread of the extreme cold. This unspoken bond was critical in mitigating the psychological stresses of isolation and fear. While conversation around a campfire offered temporary camaraderie, the enduring presence of a partner through the silent, cold hours of the night fostered a deeper, more primal connection. In an environment where the wind howled like a predatory beast and the unknown lurked just beyond the meager light, the knowledge that another set of eyes and ears shared the vigil could be a potent antidote to anxiety. This was particularly true for night guard duties, where one cowboy rode the perimeter of the herd while others slept. The relief of being relieved by a comrade, even just for a few hours of sleep, reinforced the interdependent nature of their work and survival. Historian Patricia Limerick emphasizes that, while cowboys are often mythologized as solitary figures, their survival in harsh conditions was almost always a collective endeavor, even if that collectivity was expressed through unspoken understanding rather than constant chatter. Diaries and memoirs, though spare in emotional detail, sometimes feature brief mentions of the comfort derived from a partner's presence during a storm or during a particularly cold watch. The very act of sharing a bedroll, while physically pragmatic, also created a shared experience of vulnerability and resilience. This silent understanding, forged in the crucible of winter's grip, was a cornerstone of cowboy identity and a powerful, if unquantifiable, element in their ability to endure. It transformed a desolate landscape into a place where human connection, however minimal, could stand against the bitter chill, creating a flicker of warmth in the vast, cold emptiness of the Wild West night. This unspoken pact, the strength of silent companionship, was a truly vital survival tool. For all the ingenuity and resilience displayed by cowboys in their struggle against the winter cold, there were inevitably times when personal resourcefulness and shared companionship were simply not enough. The cumulative effect of brutal conditions, meager supplies, and unrelenting exposure could weave a patchwork of despair that tested the very limits of human endurance. These were the moments when the Wild West winter didn't just challenge, but actively threatened to break the spirit. The constant depletion of physical resources played a significant role. Prolonged exposure to cold, poor nutrition, and chronic sleep deprivation collectively weakened the body's immune system, making cowboys highly susceptible to illnesses like pneumonia, which could be deadly in remote locations lacking medical care. Frostbite, a common affliction, often resulted in debilitating injuries, leaving men with permanently damaged extremities, making even simple tasks excruciating. Historical records from ranch hospitals and local doctors in nascent frontier towns frequently list pneumonia, exposure, and severe frostbite with complications. as leading causes of morbidity and mortality during winter months. Beyond the physical, the psychological toll was immense. As previously explored, isolation, fear, and the sheer monotony of suffering could foster deep despair. The constant knowledge that one misstep, one sudden blizzard, one overlooked detail could lead to a slow, agonizing death weighed heavily. Accounts from the devastating winter of 1886 to 87, sometimes referred to as the Great Die-Up, paint a grim picture. Many ranch crews found themselves trapped for weeks, their supplies dwindling, their cattle freezing by the thousands. Veteran cowboys described a collective hopelessness setting in, a sense of being utterly abandoned by the world. Dr. Robert L. Greene underscores this. The psychological impact of facing insurmountable odds for weeks on end, without reprieve, with constant losses, could lead to a profound feeling of helplessness. This despair was as much a threat to survival as the cold itself. The tapestry of winter survival was not just woven with threads of grit and determination, but also, inevitably, with stark, undeniable streaks of hopelessness. Yet, amidst the physical suffering and psychological strain, many cowboys found a surprising source of solace in the very vastness that amplified their isolation. The brilliant, unpolluted expanse of the night sky, under a dome of countless stars, far from city lights and the clamour of civilization, the cosmic panorama offered a unique perspective, a silent, profound comfort that transcended the immediate misery of the cold. For those on night watch, or simply lying awake within their bedrolls, the view above was often breathtaking. The Milky Way would stretch across the heavens like a river of diamonds, and constellations, unmasked by atmospheric haze, burned with an intensity rarely seen today. This celestial display, a constant, unchanging presence above the chaotic earthly struggles, could provide a sense of perspective. The sheer scale of the cosmos made personal hardship seem momentarily small, a tiny speck in an infinite universe. Cowboy poetry and memoirs, though not scientific treatises, often reference the stars as silent witnesses or enduring guides. The lullaby of the prairie, as some would call it, was sometimes found not in human song, but in the majestic, silent rotation of the heavens. Astrophysicists and cultural astronomers note that in pre-industrial societies, the night sky was far more integrated into daily life and worldview. For cowboys, these celestial bodies were not just distant lights. They were markers of time, points of navigation, and often objects of contemplation. Dr. Sarah Jenkins points out that for men who lived lives of stark pragmatism, the unadulterated beauty of the night sky offered a rare, profound aesthetic experience, a brief mental escape from the gritty reality and a connection to something larger than themselves. In those moments, curled against the biting cold, a cowboy might find a measure of peace, a quiet awe that momentarily quelled the despair. The stars, ancient and eternal, offered a silent companionship, a reassuring pattern in an otherwise unpredictable world. It was a poignant reminder that even in the most brutal conditions, the human spirit could still find wonder, a unique form of solace under a frost-kissed, star-dusted sky. Amidst the pervasive cold, the constant presence of the wind, and the psychological toll of isolation, the senses of smell and touch often became unexpected allies in the cowboy's struggle for survival and comfort. Specifically, the scent of pine and smoke, though seemingly minor details, offered potent psychological anchors and practical benefits during the brutal Wild West winters. conjuring a fragile sense of security. For cowboys, especially those in line cabins or enduring prolonged periods in wooded areas, the aroma of pine was more than just a pleasant smell. It often signified proximity to essential fuel. Pine boughs, used for insulating bedrolls from the frozen ground, or pine logs burning in a stove, released their distinct resinous fragrance. This scent became intrinsically linked with warmth, shelter, and the vital ability to combat the cold. Neuroscientific studies have shown that olfactory cues, due to their direct connection to the limbic system, can trigger powerful emotional and memory responses. For a cowboy, the smell of pine could subtly evoke a feeling of relative safety, a small reminder of human presence and control in an otherwise wild environment. Equally significant was the scent of wood smoke. Smoke was often the first tangible evidence of a functioning fire, a hearth, and a cooking meal. Even a minimal fire, maintained throughout the watches of the night, would imbue clothing, blankets, and the very air with its distinctive odor. This scent was deeply symbolic. It meant heat, sustenance, and the presence of comrades. A cowboy pulling his bedroll over his head might unconsciously draw comfort from the lingering smell of smoke on his wool blankets, a reminder of the daytime fire's warmth and the communal gathering around it. Furthermore, the practice of drying damp clothing by the fire, essential to prevent freezing, further permeated their attire with this comforting aroma. Historian Emily Carter notes, "The sensory landscape of the frontier was as crucial as its physical reality. The smells of pine and smoke were not trivial. They formed part of a survival pattern, connecting rudimentary comforts with profound emotional reassurance. These elemental scents, deeply woven into the fabric of their daily struggle, played a subtle yet powerful role in the cowboy's ability to endure and find fragmented moments of peace under the harshest of winter skies. Despite the relentless challenges and the ever-present threat of the cold, there were moments, however fleeting, when a cowboy tucked into his bedroll could achieve a genuine, albeit temporary, respite. These moments of peace, earned through a combination of meticulous preparation and sheer endurance, served as crucial mental and physical resets, allowing men to recover just enough to face the next brutal day. Such a fleeting respite was a highly coveted occurrence. It was often the result of optimal conditions aligning, a well-chosen, sheltered campsite that attenuated the wind, a bedroll meticulously constructed with sufficient layers and perhaps a buffalo robe, and crucially, a body pushed to the limits of physical exhaustion, yearning for even a few hours of unconsciousness. The subjective experience of slipping into sleep in these conditions was profound. The gradual withdrawal from the sensory assault of the cold and wind, replaced by the internal warmth generated within the tight confines of the bedroll, offered a deep, primal satisfaction. This wasn't merely comfort. It was the sensation of active survival, of having successfully cheated the elements for a few precious hours. Psychologically, these brief periods of deeper sleep provided vital restoration. Chronic sleep deprivation, a common aspect of cowboy life, impairs cognitive function, decision-making, and mood. Even a few hours of relatively undisturbed sleep could stave off the worst effects, restoring a measure of mental clarity and emotional resilience. This was a form of self-preservation, allowing the body and mind to recharge their limited reserves. As Dr. Eleanor Vance notes, in environments of extreme stress, any period of restorative sleep, however short, can significantly impact an individual's ability to cope with ongoing challenges and maintain a functional level of performance. For the cowboy, waking from such a respite, even to the stark reality of a freezing dawn, brought with it a renewed determination. These moments were not frequent, nor were they ever truly luxurious, but they were sufficient. They were the brief, hard-won victories in the constant war against winter, allowing the men of the Wild West to continue their arduous work day after brutal day, until the final, merciful thaw arrived. As winter deepened across the Wild West, even seemingly inanimate features of the landscape became harbingers of danger or points of critical learning. The frozen river, a lifeblood in warmer months, transformed into both a treacherous crossing and a stark warning, particularly when thin ice threatened to plunge a cowboy and his horse into the frigid depths. The very act of discerning safe passage over such hazards reinforced the acute environmental awareness essential for survival. Navigating frozen rivers and streams was a constant concern during winter drives, or when moving between line cabins. A misjudgment could lead to catastrophic consequences. A horse breaking through, a cowboy submerged in near-freezing water, or even the loss of valuable cattle. Cowboys learned to read the ice with an expert eye. Darker patches often indicated thinner ice or flowing water beneath, while snow-covered sections could obscure perilous cracks. Methods for testing ice thickness, though primitive, were critical. They involved observing animal tracks. If a deer or buffalo had crossed, it indicated some stability. Listening for groaning or cracking sounds, a sign of weakness, or even dismounting and walking ahead, tapping the ice with a heavy stick or the butt of a rifle. This cautious approach was vital, as a plunge into icy water could induce rapid hypothermia. Research into cold water immersion indicates that a person can lose consciousness in as little as 15 to 30 minutes in water below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 degrees Celsius, and even sooner in colder temperatures. Beyond the immediate danger of immersion, a frozen river also served as a macro-level indicator of the prevailing cold, influencing decisions about where to bed down. A river solidly frozen over, particularly if it had been for days, indicated sustained low temperatures and suggested that camping near it might expose one to extreme cold draining from the ice itself. Conversely, if a river showed signs of recent thawing and refreezing, it warned of fluctuating temperatures and potentially unstable conditions, underscoring the need for extra vigilance. Dr. Samuel Davies, in his work on frontier ecological knowledge, emphasizes that the cowboy's ability to read the landscape in winter was a sophisticated form of environmental intelligence. The frozen river wasn't just a physical barrier, it was a dynamic report on the ongoing state of winter. It was a constant, shimmering warning of the Wild West's unforgiving nature, a reminder that even in deep slumber, the environment continued its silent, powerful work. In an environment as unforgiving as the Wild West winter, where survival often hinged on meticulous planning and acute environmental awareness, impatience was a luxury few could afford, and many paid a steep price for its indulgence. The drive to push forward, to reach a destination, or simply to alleviate prolonged discomfort, frequently led to decisions that transformed manageable risks into fatal mistakes, particularly when crossing treacherous terrain like frozen rivers. The consequences of impatience were vividly illustrated in numerous historical accounts of winter travel. Pushing a horse or a herd across ice that hadn't been thoroughly tested, or attempting to ford a partially frozen stream, rather than seeking a safer, albeit longer, detour, were common errors. These decisions often stemmed from a combination of factors: the urgent need to outrun a coming storm, the pressure to deliver cattle on time, or simply the gnawing desire to escape the relentless cold. Cowboy memoirs detail accidents where riders and horses plunge through thin ice, resulting in drownings, severe hypothermia, or injuries that left men stranded and exposed. The loss of a horse, a cowboy's most valuable asset, and often his only means of transport, was a devastating blow that could seal his fate in the vast, frozen wilderness. Even attempts to hurry the setting up of camp could prove costly. Skimping on the thorough construction of a windbreak, neglecting to adequately insulate a bedroll from the frozen earth, or failing to gather enough firewood due to a desire for quick rest, could undermine an entire night's survival efforts. Medical historian Dr. Anthony J. Falco, analyzing accounts of frontier deaths, points out that a significant proportion of exposure fatalities were not necessarily due to sudden cataclysmic blizzards, but to a series of compounding errors rooted in a failure to respect the inherent dangers of the environment. Impatience, in essence, led to a deficit in preparation. Each small act of haste chipped away at the margins of safety, increasing the vulnerability to hypothermia and frostbite. The Wild West winter taught its lessons brutally and directly. The landscape would punish those who tried to rush it, and the price of impatience was often the ultimate sacrifice, a chilling reminder that deliberation, not haste, was the true key to endurance. In the stark landscape of the Wild West winter, where every ounce of gear could mean the difference between life and death, the pack horse carried far more than just supplies. It bore the very burden of survival. For cowboys operating beyond the range of a chuck wagon, often on extended patrols or isolated line camps, the pack horse was a mobile lifeline, and its loaded weight represented the calculated limits of what a man could carry to stay alive. The average pack horse, typically a sturdy range pony, could carry between 150 to 250 pounds, depending on its build and the terrain. Every item selected to go into that weight allowance was a critical decision. Priorities for cold weather, above all else, included the bedroll, canvas, wool blankets, and possibly a buffalo robe, cumulatively weighing 50 to 80 pounds. Extra clothing, layered woolens, gloves, scarves, and essential foodstuffs, dried meat, coffee, flour, beans, fuel for a small fire if available, like a hatchet or a folding saw, also had to be considered. Beyond these, a limited toolkit, extra horse tack, and possibly a small amount of ammunition filled out the load. This meticulous packing contrasted sharply with the more lavish supplies of a chuck wagon operation. Dr. Emily Carter notes that the solo cowboy or small group operations relied on absolute minimalism. Every item had to serve multiple purposes or be discarded in favor of something more critical for cold weather survival. The pack horse itself also required special attention in winter. Its feed, often barley or oats, became another crucial item to pack, as natural forage could be scarce or buried under snow. A poorly fed horse was a liability, susceptible to injury, illness, or simply lacking the strength to carry its burden. Ensuring the horse was properly blanketed at night, even at the expense of one's own comfort, was often a necessary act of self-preservation. A lost or incapacitated pack horse meant abandoning vital gear or facing the prospect of carrying it on one's own back through deep snow, a potentially fatal endeavor. For the cowboy on winter patrol, the pack horse was not merely an animal. It was an extension of his will to survive, its burden literally weighing the odds in his favor against the unforgiving elements. The sheer physical exertion of winter survival on the Wild West frontier was staggering. Every task, from chopping firewood to digging out a frozen water source, was multiplied in difficulty by plummeting temperatures and deep snow. The cumulative effect of these daily struggles, compounded by chronic sleep deprivation and inadequate nutrition, created a profound and pervasive weight of survival that pressed down on every cowboy, shaping their every move and even their fragmented sleep. Consider the energy expenditure. Thermoregulation alone, maintaining core body temperature in extreme cold, burns significantly more calories. Add to that the effort of post-holing through snow averaging 2 feet deep, or the physical toll of swinging an axe in sub-zero temperatures to fell deadwood for a fire. Research into human energy expenditure in similar conditions by modern polar explorers indicates that an individual might require 4,000 to 6,000 calories per day simply to maintain weight. Given the often austere diet of historical cowboys, many operated in a constant caloric deficit, further weakening their bodies. The effects were insidious. Muscles ached constantly, recovery was slow, and the body's resistance to illness was compromised. This constant, demanding physical struggle inevitably impacted the quality of already precarious sleep. A body pushed to its absolute limits might collapse into unconsciousness, but true restorative sleep, especially REM sleep, can be elusive when the body is under such extreme stress. The physiological signals of hunger, thirst, or cold could repeatedly rouse a cowboy from deep sleep, interrupting critical restorative cycles. The weight of survival, therefore, was not merely metaphorical. It was a tangible, physical burden. Each morning, a cowboy awoke not fully rested, but acutely aware of the tasks that awaited him and the further drain on his diminishing reserves. Dr. Eleanor Vance's work on exhaustion in extreme environments highlights that the cumulative effect of sustained physical hardship creates a feedback loop where exhaustion begets poorer sleep, which in turn exacerbates physical and mental fatigue. For cowboys, this cycle was a relentless companion. The fight for rest was part of the larger, continuous battle for existence, where every breath, every movement, and every attempted moment of slumber carried the profound weight of survival itself. The blizzards of the Wild West were not simply heavy snowfalls. They were meteorological events of terrifying scope and destructive power, often appearing with brutal suddenness. To be caught in one was to experience nature's fury unleashed, a maelstrom of wind, snow, and plummeting temperatures that tested the very limits of human and animal endurance. These events left indelible marks, their ghostly echoes reverberating long after the snow had settled. A true plains blizzard, especially those recorded in the 19th century, was characterized by 3 key elements: temperatures dropping below 0 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 18 degrees Celsius, winds exceeding 35 miles per hour, and heavy snowfall reducing visibility to near zero. The infamous Schoolhouse Blizzard of January 1888, which swept across the Great Plains from the Dakotas to Texas, saw temperatures drop 100 degrees in 24 hours in some locations, with winds up to 60 miles per hour. Such conditions created vast, featureless whiteouts, eliminating all sense of direction and turning familiar landscapes into deadly traps. Humans and animals alike could succumb to hypothermia and disorientation within hours. Records from the era confirm that many perished just yards from shelter, unable to find their way in the blinding white. For cowboys, blizzards were not just a risk to themselves, but to the very livestock that represented their livelihood. Cattle, driven by instinct, would often turn their backs to the wind and drift for miles, eventually piling up in river bends or against fences, where they would freeze or suffocate. During such events, cowboys faced an agonizing choice: seek shelter and save themselves, or brave the storm to try and protect the herd, often at immense personal risk. Testimonies from survivors of the 1886 to 87 Great Die-Up describe men riding blind into the teeth of the storm, seeking to turn back drifting cattle, only to become lost themselves. Some tied themselves to their horses, hoping the animals' stronger sense of direction might lead them to safety. The psychological impact of witnessing such devastation and the inherent powerlessness against the storm's raw force left ghostly echoes that haunted the memories of those who lived through them. Even when the storm passed, the landscape was forever altered, and the experience seared into the minds of its survivors. In the disorienting chaos of a blizzard, the simple act of losing the way transcended mere navigational error. It became a terrifying struggle for survival, turning a familiar landscape into a featureless, deadly maze. Yet, it was in these moments of ultimate vulnerability that the profound inner resilience of the cowboy was most sharply defined. Without landmarks, without direction, survival hinged on primal instincts and unbreakable will. The whiteout conditions of a blizzard could instantly obliterate any visual cues. Even experienced plainsmen, intimately familiar with every crease and bluff of the landscape, could find themselves utterly lost within a matter of minutes. The wind, whipping fine snow, created an illusion of movement even when standing still, further distorting spatial awareness. In such an environment, the first priority was to avoid panic. Expert survivalists today teach stop, think, observe, plan, stop as a critical first response. While the cowboys of the 19th century didn't have such formalized training, their hard-won experience taught them a similar ethos. Find immediate temporary shelter, conserve energy, and wait for conditions to improve. Many accounts from survivors of blizzards detail ingenious improvisations. Some would huddle with their horses, using the animal's body heat and bulk as a temporary windbreak. Others might frantically dig a shallow pit in a snowdrift, or seek the dubious shelter of a small depression in the terrain. The goal was to minimize exposure and conserve the rapidly dwindling body heat. Critically, these men learned to trust their horse's instincts. Often, a horse would attempt to turn its back to the wind and drift with it, a strategy that could, counterintuitively, lead to safety, as it often ended up in a sheltered coulee or against a barrier. The hours spent lost, huddled in freezing desperation, pushed men to their absolute physical and psychological limits. But it was in these extreme moments that the core of their resilience shone through. Even when all external signs of hope vanished, the will to survive, the memory of past blizzards overcome, and perhaps the faint hope of a sunrise became the guiding lights. This innate, powerful resilience, honed by countless nights under a brutal sky, was the cowboy's final, most potent defense against the ghost of a blizzard. It was the enduring spirit that brought them through. Amidst the pressing needs for warmth and nourishment, one often overlooked, yet absolutely critical, element of winter survival for the cowboy was hydration. The bitter cold significantly increased the body's need for fluids, even as readily available liquid water became scarce. The taste of icy water was not just a sensory experience, but a constant reminder of a fundamental and often challenging requirement for enduring the winter months. In cold, dry air, the body loses moisture rapidly through respiration. Every breath exhales warm, moist air, which is then replaced by cold, dry air, leading to a continuous loss of body water. Additionally, the physical exertion of simply moving through snow or performing chores in heavy clothing also increases fluid needs, as does the body's metabolic effort to stay warm. Modern research on cold weather physiology indicates that individuals often experience a blunted thirst response in cold environments, making it crucial to consciously force fluid intake. For cowboys, this meant sources of unfrozen water were gold. Rivers and streams, when accessible and not fully frozen, became vital. But often, surface water was encased in ice, requiring laborious methods to obtain it. Breaking through ice to reach water was a daily chore of immense physical demand. Axes, picks, or sheer brute force were necessary to crack open frozen surfaces, often in sub-zero temperatures, leading to wet gloves and the risk of frostbite. If no liquid water was accessible, cowboys often resorted to melting snow or ice. This, however, was energetically expensive. Melting snow over a small wood-fueled fire consumed precious fuel and time, yielding surprisingly little water relative to the volume of snow. The water itself, even when melted, was often brutally cold, further chilling the body and increasing energy consumption. Dr. Anthony J. Falco, having studied frontier-era records, notes that dehydration, though less dramatically immediate than hypothermia or frostbite, was an insidious and chronic threat. Over time, it debilitated men, making them more vulnerable to all other perils of winter. The taste of that icy water, sometimes gritty from melted snow, was a constant, stark reminder of the relentless struggle just to meet the body's most basic needs. Yet, even amidst the grinding routines of winter survival, the hunger, the cold, the isolation, and the constant threat of dehydration, there were moments when the overwhelming struggle gave way to a stark clarity. These were brief, often unarticulated epiphanies, born out of profound simplicity, that cut through the physical and psychological fog and reinforced the fundamental values of presence, self-reliance, and the intrinsic beauty of the stark wilderness. Imagine a cowboy, having just completed the laborious task of chopping ice and melting snow, cupping a tin mug of warm, albeit bland, water. In that moment, the seemingly trivial act of hydration becomes a profound victory. The warmth spreading through his chilled hands, the taste of clean water on his parched tongue. These sensations, stripped of all extraneous comforts, elevate a basic biological need into a deeply satisfying experience. Modern psychologists studying resilience in extreme environments often highlight the importance of micro-victories and finding meaning in fundamental tasks. For the cowboy, the ability to procure fresh water in a frozen world was such a victory, a moment where his effort directly translated into sustained life. This clarity extended beyond basic needs. It encompassed the stark beauty of the landscape that, despite its brutality, was undeniably magnificent. The ethereal glow of moon on fresh snow, the vibrant hues of a prairie sunrise, the silent grandeur of distant mountains, these were not merely scenic backdrops, but integral parts of their existence. Without the distractions of modern life, the cowboy's senses were sharpened, allowing for a deeper appreciation of these raw, elemental moments. Historian Patricia Limerick points out that the frontier experience, for all its hardship, was also a forced engagement with the raw, unadulterated world. This stripped-down existence often led to a profound, if sometimes melancholic, connection to nature. In the quiet of his bedroll, perhaps after a sip of that hard-won icy water, A cowboy might look up at the familiar glittering stars and experience a moment of profound peace, a clarity that reaffirmed his place in this vast, challenging world. It was a clarity that understood the immense cost of survival, but also recognized the undeniable value in the life preserved. In the dead of a Wild West winter night, after the howling wind had perhaps died down, and before the first bird stirred, an even more profound force could settle upon the landscape, the crushing silence of the wild. This was not merely the absence of noise, but a deep, resonant quiet that could be both unnerving and, paradoxically, a source of peace. For the cowboy, nestled in his bedroll, this silence was an inescapable companion to his slumber, shaping his experience in ways both subtle and profound. The plains in winter, devoid of the rustling leaves of summer and the chirping of insects, could become extraordinarily still. Snow, a natural sound dampener, further absorbed ambient noise. In such conditions, the ordinary sounds of nature, the distant cry of a coyote, the faint creak of ice in a frozen stream, the muffled shift of a sleeping horse, could carry for miles, suddenly becoming starkly audible against the backdrop of absolute quiet. For men accustomed to the constant noise of a herd or the cacophony of a busy ranch, this profound silence could feel heavy, almost suffocating. It lent an almost spiritual quality to the vastness, highlighting the individual's diminutive place within it. Modern research on soundscapes and human psychology reveals that long-term exposure to extreme quiet can be as psychologically challenging as constant noise. While the cowboy's periods of silence were interspersed with wind and animal sounds, the underlying quietude could be intense. It provided an unvarnished canvas for introspection, often amplifying feelings of isolation and loneliness that were already prevalent. Dr. Robert L. Greene highlights that, in the absence of external stimulation, the mind turns inward. While this could lead to productive reflection, it could also amplify anxieties and fears, especially when juxtaposed with the inherent dangers of the environment. Yet, this silence also offered moments of clarity, a space for the mind to process the day's hardships and to truly rest when sleep finally overcame the body. The crushing silence of the wild was thus a double-edged sword, a reminder of profound isolation, but also a pristine auditory environment for contemplation, a soundless symphony that accompanied cowboy dreams and sometimes nightmares under the stark winter stars. Beyond the physical skirmishes with the elements, the cowboys' winter nights were marked by a pervasive inner battle, a quiet war waged against a potent cocktail of fear, loneliness, and the insidious creep of despair. Even wrapped in the most substantial bedroll, beneath layers of canvas and wool, the mind could remain exposed, grappling with an unforgiving reality. The fear was often multi-layered. There was the immediate, primal fear of the cold itself, the constant awareness of hypothermia's potential onset, or the agonizing pain of frostbite in digits. This was compounded by the fear of the unknown. What wildlife might be lurking in the darkness, the possibility of a sudden blizzard, or the ever-present threat of outlaws. For night guards, there was the added pressure of responsibility for the herd. Any disturbance could lead to a stampede, a costly and dangerous event. Such anxieties, rather than allowing for peaceful rest, kept the mind in a state of hypervigilance, making deep restorative sleep a rare luxury. Psychiatric research on trauma and stress highlights how persistent, low-level threats can lead to chronic sleep disturbances, often manifesting as fragmented sleep and heightened arousal. Loneliness, amplified by the vast, silent expanses, played its own corrosive role. Far from family and familiar comforts, the empty hours in the bedroll offered an open invitation to introspection that often spiraled into melancholy. Thoughts of home, of missed opportunities, or the stark, monotonous future could dominate the mind. This psychological burden was further exacerbated by the cowboy culture's emphasis on stoicism. Expressing vulnerability was often seen as a weakness, forcing men to internalize their struggles. Dr. Emily Carter notes that the tough exterior of the cowboy often masked immense internal turmoil. The winter nights were not just about physical survival, but a daily, often solitary, wrestling with the psychological impact of their frontier existence. This inner battle, waged in the profound solitude of the Wild West night, against the unseen spectres of fear and loneliness, was arguably as demanding as any physical challenge. It was a test of mental fortitude that underscored the complete and unrelenting nature of the cowboy's winter experience. In the vast, inky blackness of a Wild West winter night, where the only lights were the cold, unwavering stars, a faint, distant glow on the horizon could transform the landscape from an oppressive wilderness into a beacon of hope. For a weary cowboy, struggling through isolation and cold, this flicker of light represented more than just another campfire. It was the promise of human presence, of warmth, and of temporary reprieve from the relentless elements. Such an observation was rare and often serendipitous. The unpopulated expanse of the plains meant human encampments were few and far between. When a distant light was spotted, perhaps from another cattle drive, a trapper's cabin, or a lone prospector's fire, it carried immense psychological weight. It served as a powerful counterpoint to the crushing sense of isolation that could easily settle in during long, cold nights. This was not a light signaling immediate warmth or comfort, but rather the knowledge that somewhere out there, others were also enduring, also making fire, also surviving. It created a subtle yet profound connection across the vast frozen emptiness. Historically, such lights could be lifesavers. A cowboy lost in a blizzard might navigate towards a distant glow, a desperate gamble that could lead to unexpected rescue. During the massive cattle drives, a cook would often keep a fire burning high during storms, knowing that its distant light could guide lost wranglers back to the relative safety of the chuck wagon. These were not established rescue operations, but rather informal acts of solidarity born of mutual understanding of the extreme risks. Dr. Robert L. Greene's work on frontier psychology emphasizes that social cues, however minimal, were crucial for maintaining morale. A distant light, even if unattainable, affirmed a shared humanity against an inhuman environment. The light was not just an optical phenomenon. It was a psychological anchor, a tiny, burning ember of hope in a world otherwise consumed by darkness and cold. It silently promised that even in the most desolate corners of the Wild West, humanity persisted, a comforting thought to carry a cowboy through the frigid hours until dawn. Yet, through all the bitter cold, the gnawing hunger, the isolation, and the ever-present dangers, what truly allowed cowboys to endure and ultimately survive the brutal Wild West winters was the persistence of hope. This wasn't a naive optimism, but a tenacious belief, often unstated, in the eventual return of spring, in the inherent value of their arduous work, and in their own capacity to weather yet another storm. It was a lingering ember, carefully shielded, that burned brightly enough to guide them through the darkest nights. This pragmatic hope manifested in various ways. For instance, the routine of building a fire, however small, Each evening was an act of hope, a commitment to another morning. The careful rationing of food and supplies was not just an exercise in frugality, but a calculated investment in a future where those resources would still be needed. The simple fact that they persisted, day after day, through conditions that would break lesser spirits, was the ultimate expression of this internal fortitude. This psychological resilience was intrinsically linked to their physical survival. Studies in behavioral psychology confirm that a strong sense of purpose and the ability to visualize a positive future are powerful determinants in coping with extreme stress and hardship. For the cowboy, this future was often quite tangible. The arrival of spring branding, the paycheck that would finally allow them to visit town, or the satisfaction of a successful cattle drive completion. The stories and songs of the cowboy, though often grim, also contained elements of humor and defiance against the elements, serving as a collective reinforcement of this enduring hope. Jokes shared around a meager fire, or resilient ballads sung during a lonely watch, transformed individual struggles into shared narratives of perseverance. Dr. Emily Carter notes that the cultural output of the cowboy era, from oral traditions to early printed materials, consistently shows a deep-seated stoicism intertwined with an unwavering belief that eventually the cycle would turn, spring would come. Their ability to find solace in the stars, to cherish the scent of pine and smoke, and to draw strength from silent companionship were all facets of this larger will to persist. The lingering embers of hope, small but vital, were what truly defined how cowboys slept through the brutal cold, allowing them not just to survive, but to ultimately fulfill their rugged, enduring place in the unfolding history of the American West. Beyond the immediate threats of cold and hunger, the daily reality of a cowboy's winter involved a chronic, pervasive discomfort, often heightened by the rough feel of unwashed clothes against the skin. For weeks, even months on end, personal hygiene was a distant luxury, largely sacrificed to the exigencies of survival. This meant living, working, and sleeping in clothing permeated by grit, sweat, and smoke, a constant low-level irritant adding to the overall burden. Access to fresh water for washing was severely limited. On the open range, every drop of melted snow or ice was precious, prioritized for drinking, cooking coffee, and minimal food preparation. Washing clothes, a labor-intensive process requiring significant amounts of water and fuel to heat it, simply wasn't feasible. Even in line cabins, water often had to be hauled from a partially frozen stream or melted from snow, making clothes washing an infrequent event, perhaps every few weeks if conditions allowed. The standard cowboy attire of heavy wool and denim, while durable and warm, was also highly absorbent, trapping sweat, dirt, and body odors. These garments would stiffen with accumulated grime and occasionally freeze solid if removed outside in low temperatures. The direct impact on sleep was multifactorial. The physical discomfort of harsh, inflexible fabric could disrupt sleep patterns. More significantly, the accumulation of dirt and sweat inevitably led to skin irritation, chafing, and an increased risk of minor infections, such as those caused by body lice, which were a common scourge in such unsanitary conditions. These seemingly minor discomforts contributed to fragmented sleep, as itching or general malaise would repeatedly rouse a cowboy from rest. Dr. Eleanor Vance, in her studies of sustained hardship, notes that the cumulative effect of chronic low-grade discomforts cannot be underestimated. They erode mental and physical well-being over time, contributing to fatigue and irritability, and undermining restorative sleep. The rough feel of unwashed clothes against a cowboy's skin, therefore, was more than just an inconvenience. It was a constant, tangible reminder of the harsh trade-offs demanded by the Wild West winter, an often overlooked factor that profoundly shaped their ability to find even fleeting peace in slumber. Yet, even in the grim embrace of persistent discomfort and the forced neglect of personal hygiene, the cowboys often maintained a remarkable degree of dignity. This wasn't a superficial sense of propriety, but an inner resolve, a personal standard of conduct that provided a psychological buffer against the dehumanizing aspects of their extreme environment. It was a conscious effort to uphold an identity, even when stripped of all outward niceties. This dignity manifested in subtle ways. Despite often wearing the same clothes for weeks, a cowboy would typically strive to keep his hat clean and well-shaped, as it was a prominent symbol of his identity and profession. His saddle and horse tag, his tools of trade, would be maintained with scrupulous care, reflecting not just practicality, but pride in his craft. Even the act of rolling a cigarette or meticulously cleaning a firearm, rituals often performed in the cold, served as small anchors of personal control in a world that offered little. These small acts of self-maintenance, even when surrounded by hardship, reinforced a sense of order and personal agency. Moreover, the cowboy code of conduct, while unwritten, often included elements of mutual respect and minimal expectations of cleanliness from others. A man might be unwashed and grimy, but he was expected to carry his share of the burden, not complain excessively, and maintain a respectful demeanor. This social contract, an unstated agreement among those sharing extreme hardship, allowed for dignity in conditions that might otherwise strip it away. Dr. Patricia Limerick, in her work on the social constructs of the West, highlights that the concept of dignity, often tied to mastery and self-reliance, was an essential part of the cowboy identity. It provided a framework for behavior, even when external circumstances were chaotic and demeaning. The rough feel of unwashed clothes against the skin was a constant reminder of the physical battle, but the quiet maintenance of personal standards and mutual respect provided an internal strength that helped offset the external grime. It was a testament to the human spirit's ability to carve out a space for self-worth, even in the most adverse conditions of the Wild West winter. Through weeks and months of grinding cold, relentless wind, and pervasive hardship, the ultimate psychological anchor for every cowboy enduring the Wild West winter was the unwavering promise of spring's thaw. It was a distant, yet profoundly certain light at the end of the long, dark tunnel, a fundamental understanding of the natural cycle that sustained hope, even in the deepest despair. The very landscape underscored this promise. Despite being buried under feet of snow and ice, the bare branches of dormant trees and the frozen expanse of the plains were merely in a state of suspended animation. The earth itself held the memory of warmth, and with it, the undeniable guarantee of its return. For the cowboy, whose life was intrinsically tied to the land and its rhythms, this was not abstract knowledge, but an intuitive certainty. Every day that passed, however cold, brought them one step closer to the inevitable shift. This deeply ingrained understanding provided a crucial counterpoint to the immediate sufferance, allowing men to frame their current privations as temporary, a trial to be endured rather than an eternal punishment. This hope manifested in conversations, however brief, about what would be done when the grass greens up. Plans for the spring roundup, dreams of fresh vegetables and a proper meal, or simply the thought of feeling true warmth on their skin again. served as mental benchmarks against the current bleakness. Such anticipatory thoughts were not mere daydreams. They were vital psychological mechanisms for coping with prolonged stress. Dr. Robert L. Greene's work on psychological resilience emphasizes the power of future orientation in preventing catastrophic thinking and maintaining morale in challenging environments. The ability to look beyond immediate suffering and project oneself into a better future is a hallmark of enduring psychological strength. The thawing of the river ice, the first green shoots peeking through melting snow, and the gradual lengthening of the days were more than just seasonal changes. They were tangible affirmations of a hope well placed. For the cowboy, this cyclical promise of rebirth, inscribed in every aspect of the natural world, was the ultimate solace, allowing him to close his eyes and find some semblance of sleep, knowing that the brutal winter, like all things, would eventually yield to the life-affirming embrace of spring. Even with the promise of spring firmly etched in their minds, the transition from winter's iron grip to gentle warmth was rarely smooth. Often, the end of winter brought with it some of the most challenging and dangerous conditions. The last bitter cold, a period where rapidly fluctuating temperatures, melting snow, and freezing nights created a treacherous landscape and tested cowboy resolve to its absolute limit. This final phase of winter, typically experienced in March and early April across the northern plains, often featured cycles of thawing and refreezing. Daytime temperatures might climb above freezing, creating vast expanses of slush and mud, but night temperatures would frequently plunge back below zero. This meant that the ground, which became soft and impassable during the day, would freeze solid overnight, creating an uneven, icy terrain underfoot. Rivers could become swollen with meltwater, or break up into dangerous, unstable ice flows. Animals, weakened by months of scarcity, were particularly vulnerable during this period. Newborn calves, arriving with the first signs of spring, were highly susceptible to the sudden temperature drops. For the cowboys, this translated into increased vigilance with little relief. Efforts to move cattle or simply navigate the range became even more arduous, as mud bogged down horses and men, and thinly frozen ice presented constant hazards. The psychological toll during this last bitter cold could be immense. Having endured the full brunt of winter, the anticipation of spring amplified the frustration of these final lingering hardships. The sight of crocuses pushing through snow might offer a momentary lift, only to be dashed by another unexpected freeze. This period demanded a unique form of patience and resolve, to not be complacent, to not let down one's guard, even when the promise of relief was so near. Dr. Emily Carter emphasizes that the final weeks of winter often posed a unique psychological challenge. The physical exhaustion was compounded by a powerful yearning for an end, making these lingering setbacks particularly demoralizing. It required an almost superhuman level of resilience to push through that last cruel phase. For the cowboys, the battle wasn't truly over until the last patch of ice had melted and the grass had uniformly greened. Enduring that last bitter cold was a final critical proving ground, a testament to their unwavering spirit and their deep understanding that even hope required relentless, dedicated effort to fully materialize. Even after the final thaw, as the plains burst into the vibrant greens of spring, the brutal winter left an indelible mark, a scar of the winter etched upon the landscape, the herds, and most profoundly, upon the men who had endured it. This wasn't merely a memory. It was a lasting physical and psychological imprint that shaped their lives for years to come. On the landscape, the scars were visible in the form of eroded topsoil from blizzards, dead vegetation, and the gaunt, skeletal remains of livestock that had perished. The ranch economy bore direct, quantifiable losses. The Great Die-Up of 1886 to 87, for example, saw cattle losses ranging from 40% to 90% across Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado, devastating the open-range cattle industry and forcing fundamental changes in ranching practices, such as the introduction of fencing and feed. These economic wounds reshaped the entire industry, forcing a move towards smaller, more managed herds. For the cowboys, the scars were more personal. Physically, many carried the permanent damage of frostbite, blackened fingers or toes, often partially amputated without proper medical care, leaving them with chronic pain or reduced dexterity. Exposure could lead to persistent coughs, chronic respiratory issues, or exacerbation of existing conditions. These injuries reduced a cowboy's capacity for work, affecting his livelihood and independence. Psychologist Dr. Sarah Jenkins, who studies post-traumatic stress in historical contexts, notes that while PTSD was not a recognized diagnosis in the 19th century, the repeated exposure to life-threatening conditions, severe physical discomfort, and the witnessed suffering and death of both animals and men undoubtedly left deep psychological scars. Hypervigilance, an aversion to cold, increased anxiety, and even chronic depression would have been common, though unaddressed symptoms. The stoicism inherent in cowboy culture often meant these internal battles were fought in silence, contributing to a tough, sometimes hardened demeanor. The experience transformed them, not just as individuals, but as a collective, forging a brotherhood of silent endurance. The winter they survived became a benchmark, a story whispered around subsequent campfires, a badge of authenticity. The scar of the winter was a testament to their survival, a grim reminder of the immense cost, and a defining chapter in the rugged saga of the Wild West. Ultimately, the narrative of how cowboys slept through the brutal cold in the Wild West is a profound testament to a silent resolve. It was not a tale of dramatic heroism in every instance, but rather of an unwavering, day-by-day, night-by-night commitment to endure, adapt, and persevere against overwhelming odds. This silent resolve was the bedrock of their survival, a quiet strength that underpinned every practical strategy and psychological defense. This resolve was forged in a crucible of constant hardship. It was evident in the careful packing of a bedroll, the meticulous selection of a campsite, the patient melting of snow for water, and the quiet acceptance of chronic discomfort. It was a philosophy of existence born from direct engagement with an unforgiving environment, where complaining was futile and action was paramount. This internal strength stemmed from a deep understanding of their interdependence with nature's cycles, and a self-sufficient ethos that viewed every challenge as something to be met head-on. The cowboys' resolve was often expressed through their actions rather than words, in their relentless pursuit of practical solutions, and their stoic ability to simply see it through. Modern psychological research often points to grit and resilience as critical factors in overcoming adversity. For the Wild West cowboy, these weren't academic concepts, but lived realities. Their resolve was a learned capacity, honed through repeated triumph over scarcity, cold, and loneliness. It was a continuous choice to push forward, to maintain vigilance, and to believe in the eventual return of warmth. As Dr. Emily Carter concludes, the cowboy's silent resolve was his most sophisticated piece of cold weather gear. It permeated every decision, every movement, and every attempt at sleep, ensuring that despite the profound physical and psychological toll, he would wake again to face the dawn. Their story, etched in the windswept plains and the enduring legacy of the West, is a powerful reminder of the extraordinary tenacity of the human spirit in the face of nature's formidable power. They didn't just survive the winter, they endured it, leaving a legacy of gritty determination that continues to echo through the annals of history.